Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining the Elastic Meetup. While this meetup is not sort of geographically affiliated, I think we're just running the meetup for kind of people in the time zone. So I'd imagine people from different locations in Asia Pacific will be joining the meetup. Thanks for finding the time. Thanks for your interest in our stack. Today we have a special guest. We have Kerr from the University of Otago presenting to us about Logstash plugin development. So Cameron's done a really terrific work building his plugin. I'm not going to tell you anything else about the plugin. I'm not going to steal his thunder, but it was quite an exciting use case, and I think his plugin is, a very valuable addition to the family of plugins that Logstash has. It's kind of strong evidence to the community support that we all enjoy with Elastic. So Cameron's going to tell us about the plugin he built, about the process of building his own plugin. Gotcha's, really sort of raw and unfiltered, sort of listening to his feedback about the process and how it went. If there's anything else, Michael, do you want to add anything about the logistics or anything, or we just kick it off and just run it? Because usually we sometimes have announcements. Doesn't look like we have anything, so I'll hand it over to Cameron. Cameron, over to you. Please take it away. Thanks, and thanks for being here, everyone. You're on mute, Cameron.
Just like to start with a quick poll, just to get an idea of what people know about Logstash. So if you could put just in the chat, like a one-word sort of summary of what you know about Logstash, beginner, advanced, just to give me some idea. If you've done any plugin development before, just so I can try and adjust my material. So I've been doing a what will be a 4-part series of YouTube videos, which covers this slide deck in more detail. So if you want to go on YouTube, you can search for Teacher in Full. Me basically just going over mistakes I've made in the past, finding better ways of doing things. Enough of that. So this is a 4-part presentation condensed into 1 hour. I'm going to make some assumptions just to speed things along. So I'm going to assume that you can run Docker, or that you know and can use it. I'm going to assume that you know a bit about Logstash. I'm not going to assume that you know how to do any plugin development, or even that you have any real programming experience. So long as you have some idea of sort of what Logstash does and how it works. I am going to assume that you can at least learn a bit of programming. So I guess I am assuming that you can do some programming, but I'm not going to assume that you know any Ruby or Java. And I started out on this project not knowing either Ruby or Java. Before this project, I took perverse pride in doing 15 years of computer science and avoiding having to learn Java. So it finally got me in the end. The good news is that it was pretty good. And I'm going to assume that you know a bit about Git. I just want to run through a couple of use cases that structure the plugins that I'm demonstrating today. This presentation is not so much on these particular plugins or what they do, but it's more about how you can use Logstash to do something a bit extra. So making your own plugins. So the first set of use cases is around getting more information out of IP address details in your logs. So if you're running like a network or even just web server logs, and you've got a lot of internal IP addresses, in a similar way that we often use the GeoIP plugin to look up things like country and maybe even city information, I wanted to be able to do something similar, but using our internal IP address range information. So I might have logs relating to network activity. I might want to be able to aggregate these and say, well, show me all the logs that relate to a particular VLAN or a particular subnet. Similarly, you might have parts of your network that are geographically distributed, but are still using private addressing. So you might want to say, show me everything, all the logs or activity in a particular geographic region, like, for example, our Christchurch campus. I haven't done anything about showing those on a map, but you could, in theory, just use that to annotate in a similar way that the existing logs GeoIP information does. Now, also, when within your own network, subnets have particular semantics. So, for example, you might have various parts of your network that you would expect to have user traffic. You might have some that are servers, you might have some that are printers, you might have some in particular network areas like the DMZ, the data center somewhere on the edge, whatever. And it would be useful to be able to quickly slice through your network, through your logs, getting just that information. So you might say, well, in my user VLANs, I would expect to see certain traffic patterns compared to on my data center networks, I might expect to see a more restricted view. So that can be very useful there. In a similar way, if you want to look at your network, or you might say, okay, I've got a particular log message that I'm seeing on a switch. And you might want to know, well, I haven't seen this before. Can I see this in other parts of my network? And maybe you can say, oh, okay, I'm actually seeing this more in these parts of the network than I am in this other one. So that can help with diagnostic abilities as well. So let's have a brief thought process as to how we might actually go about this. So if you're not already familiar with it, MaxMind, the company, create the GeoIP data. They curate the GeoIP data that is used within the GeoIP plugin. And that data is distributed in the form of a MaxMind database, or MMDB. This is a fairly efficient, local, specialized data format, if you like. And it works similar to a routing table. But the way it's structured is quite open-ended. The schema that it uses depends on the particular database that you're using. So, for example, you might be using the GeoIP Lite or the GeoCity Lite database, or you might be using one that maps IPs to ASN numbers. Now, it would be really great to be able to create your own MaxMind database. The tooling for that, however, is not quite so simple. You can't readily take an existing database, such as one that MaxMind provides, add your own internal addresses, and then say, voila, let's start using this. So what I've done is, one of the things I've done is create a tool based on a blog post that MaxMind have provided. And that's written in Perl. The reason being because although MaxMind provide APIs in different languages for using a MaxMind database. The only language that they support for writing a MaxMind database is in Perl. So what I've done is I've created a tool that allows you to pass in a JSON representation of what you would like to see in your MaxMind database, and it will go and create that for you. So you could imagine presenting this as a command line tool. This is actually as a Docker thing, but that's not the prime thing that I'm wanting to show you today. Now, if we were to use the if we were to use the GeoIP plugin that Elastic provides, we would find some limitations there. One of those limitations is that it assumes a particular schema and only supports things like the GeoCity Lite or the ASN schema. But if we want something that's much more open-ended, such as what VLAN or subnet an IP address relates to, then we need something more generic. So therefore, we need to create another plugin that is similar in spirit to the filter, the GeoIP filter. So that is one of the use cases. And I've chosen to do that in a pure Java way. If you're familiar at all with modern Logstash development, you'll know, or maybe you've heard, that typically plugins are created using the using Ruby, JRuby. But these days you can also create ones that are using a pure plugin, a pure Java API, which means that you don't need to know any Ruby. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, that was possibly a step further than I wanted to go initially, considering I was sort of still learning about this process. So I wanted to take another step using another example, but this time using a Ruby plugin. So if we think of, for example, a squid proxy, let's imagine that you have your servers that are in your data center and you want to have a policy that says all machines, whenever possible, need to access the internet via a squid proxy that has various whitelisting rules applied. So in your logs within Logstash or Grafana, you would need to know, what are the top N sort of destination sites, rather than necessarily the fully qualified domain names that your servers were connecting to, because then you could more easily say, okay, well, this is strange behavior, or just use that for analytics. Now, if you've ever done this before, trying to take a fully qualified domain name and sort of summarizing that into the most significant part, it's actually quite tricky, and it's not something yet you can do generically, and you have to use eventually some extra data. That extra data is called the public suffix list, and this is a tool that that browsers like Firefox and so forth use. So the quick goals for this series, basically we want to see how we can streamline our development environment, get rid of some of the pain associated with getting started with Logstash development. We're going to have a quick look at how we can create a Ruby plugin, and then if time allows, which it probably won't, we'll consider how to do Java plugins as well. And if there's not enough time, bear in mind this stuff is also going up onto a more detailed YouTube channel. So bear in mind, I'm not a Ruby or a Java programmer, but I have supported Java plenty. I'm more of a C and Python developer. And I've been using Logstash since way back in 2012. So the good news is that Logstash doesn't change much in terms of what a config file looks like and plugins. So if you create a plugin, it's fairly easy to keep it up to date. There's not much you have to do at all. So since we have a wide variety of people, just briefly looking at the comments, I can see there are people that have done some Logstash, that are new to Logstash, that have done some plugin development. So we'll spend a little bit more time on this slide. So Logstash is a way of enriching your logs. You may have heard of the ingest node functionality, which is relatively new. Logstash was here from the beginning as such. So you would send your logs, like your syslog and so forth. This was before the day of beats. And Logstash would be the one that's receiving all your logs from the network or from files. It's enriching those, doing processes like grok to parse your logs, figure out what time it's actually talking about, doing other sort of summarization, sort of maybe just chopping things up, converting types, and so forth. Doing GeoIP is a common thing as well. So we have effectively 4 different types of plugins that you can create in Logstash. So there are input filters, there are input modules. All of these modules are plugins. There are inputs, there are filters, there are outputs, and there are also codecs. So inputs do things like read from files, receive events from the network, and they generate events that go through a pipeline. Filters operate on events in the pipeline in sequence. They do things like parsing logs and doing GeoIP lookups, changing things in whatever way is necessary. And then outputs do things like they typically receive events and send them off to something else outside of Logstash. Typically, that's going to be Elasticsearch or files or all the very other many things that Logstash supplies. So Logstash doesn't have anything in particular. It's very loosely bound with Elasticsearch. But there are lots of things you can do. Codecs, what's a good way of describing a codec? So codecs, when it's reading events like from a file, will basically say, how do I interpret a particular message and break that into a basic event. So if you've got a traditional log file, each log entry might be a line in which the plain codec will basically say, let's just read a line, call that an event, and then pass that through. Earlier on in the Logstash development, they introduced a command called Logstash plugin, so Logstash plugin generate. And this was a tool that you can use for generating plugins. Before that, you would have to actually clone a Git repo, make a whole bunch of changes, and then call that your new plugin. And that's still what it's like for Java plugins. The good news is that it's still relatively simple. As I said, plugins are classically defined in Ruby and therefore tested with RSpec, the Ruby unit testing tool. And from about 7.2, possibly 7.1, the notion of a pure Java API was made generally available. And so therefore, when you're testing that, or when you're coding this, you don't need to know anything about Ruby development tools. And you're using a version of JUnit to develop that. If you want to know the details, that's JUnit 4, not 5 as you might otherwise be familiar with. However, although all of these although it might be developed in Java or within Ruby, all your plugins, regardless of how they're developed, are distributed as gems, as Ruby gems. So that's all taken care of for you, essentially. I'm not going to show you how to go through the contribution process or publishing it. So this is the how to get started. So there are some pain points in Logstash development that when I was starting out, I really wanted to clean up. And this is one of the major outputs of my work here. So Logstash is a product that is written in Ruby, but more than that, it's written in JRuby, which means that it's an implementation of Ruby that runs on the Java virtual machine, the JVM. The reason for this is that normally Ruby has a single, kind of single-threaded, similar to Python in that regard. And from a performance point of view, JRuby running on the JVM with its hotspot and good threading has some good, useful advantages there. However, it does mean that it's actually quite slow to do anything with when you're starting up. So just bear that in mind. Because you're dealing in effectively a different Ruby architecture, one of the things you have to be very careful of is that you don't mess with the Ruby systems in your environment. You don't want to make sure that in your path environment that you're actually using the right instance of, for example, the gem or the bundler tool to actually build things and test things. Otherwise, you're going to get sometimes obscure error messages that can be quite difficult to diagnose if you're just starting out. So most of the pain points are environmental in nature. You've also got, of course, 2 ecosystems to learn. And this is true whenever you're starting a new language. It's not just the language itself, but you've also got to consider how to actually build things. How does it pull things from the internet? Do I need to use a proxy or something? How do I do the unit testing and so forth? However, the good news here is that it's not programming in the large that you're doing. So you don't need to concern yourselves with a lot of object-oriented design, for example, and most of it's fairly small amounts of code that you're dealing with. And chances are you're going to be pulling in a third-party module or something that's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Yeah, and I've mentioned Logstash to start up, and installing plugins, particularly when installing plugins, is very, very slow. But what I'm trying to streamline is the development experience. Okay, so I'll pause here. Michael, do you want to highlight any particular questions that people have asked?
Yeah, there was a question about sort of writing tests for your Ruby plugin. I think that was you answered for you basically said our spec. Is there anything else you want to add, or this is pretty much it?
I do have some material about writing RSpec plugins. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've got some questions for the end. I think they're not really sort of related, so about some IP address propagation and writing multiple Logstash. Maybe writing multiple Logstash instances on one machine. Very sort of briefly, if you want to touch on that, how would you go about that?
So in part 2, we're essentially talking about how to alleviate some of these, largely the environmental difficulties, making sure that we can easily get a set of tools up and running, configured in the right way, that when I build something, I can be sure that I'm going to get the same result on this machine compared to when I build it somewhere else, or when I want to use, for example, a continuous integration environment. And the tool of choice here, for me at least, is around containers. So bearing in mind, I'm using a Windows 10 Enterprise laptop, which has things like group policies and various other things. So I do at least have admin access, which is essentially a requirement if you're using things like Docker. I'm using Docker Desktop, which means that on Windows 10 Enterprise, I'm basically having to use Hyper-V, which is a bit annoying because I also like to use VirtualBox and Vagrant, and so those don't really coexist very well at all. I'm using Visual Studio Code, and the reason for that, other than just quite liking that that tool set myself, is that it has the notion of dev containers, and this is essentially what this part is about. A dev container, as this diagram here illustrates, is basically a way of running your local instance of Visual Studio Code, and your code itself is running within a container. The container is managed and run using Docker, but managed by Visual Studio Code over here. And the magic is this part here. Because, for example, you could run your code anyway in a Docker container or any kind of container. But the difficulty here when you're editing what is effectively remotely over here is you want things like the ability to debug your code. You want to be able to use things like code completion when it can actually see the code and the resulting libraries. You want to be able to do things like invoke development tools like static checking and linting, all of which exist in here, not over here. So what Visual Studio Code with its dev containers concept does, it starts up this container. You're effectively defining all the stuff in green here, and then it injects the various remote stubs and code that it needs within here. And you just have a bind mount for your source code. Bearing in mind, your container is going to be effectively a Linux environment, but if you're using Visual Studio Code on Windows, you're going to have line ending sort of issues that you need to iron out. So that's one of the advantages of me showing you how to do this in Windows, is that I've had to go through some of this pain and therefore have documented how to do this for you. So the idea with these dev containers is that you can build it in the dev container I've provided, and then you can take that plugin that you've created, which will be a gem file, and then you can go and run that in, for example, an official Elastic Logstash container. To get you started with this, the thing that you would like to look at is this project here, Logstash plugin dev. It's available as a Docker image, so you can pull it. At the moment, it's only released for version 7.9 of the Elastic Stack. But when I get a bit more confidence about this, then I'll release that for other versions as well. Pull requests are welcome. Although if you just want to say, I'd like this in a different version, then I can try that as well. If you wanted to get an idea of what kind of pain you're in for, you can have a look at the build information there. I will mention that this is based on CentOS 7, which is the same as as Elastic's official images. Just bear in mind, if you're trying to reverse engineer some of this based on what you find in the various Elastic repos, it can be very confusing because there are Docker files and similar things spread all over the show. Anyway, don't do that. So what I'm talking about is basically referenced in here, that it'll be in the YouTube series as well. So that will do for now. So to get started, just do a Docker pull Cameron Kerr NZ Logstash plugin dev 7.9. Bearing in mind that's the only version I'm currently supporting with this effort. And of course, it's a good thing I started this. Just starting Docker in the background while I pursue. Now, while this is using dev containers, there's nothing that prevents you from making use of this image just in a pure Docker environment. If you don't want to use Visual Studio Code, then you don't have to. And yes, in terms of the logs in the version here, this is effectively talking about the Logstash version. Specifically, this is based around the OSS version of Logstash. Not that it really makes much difference with regards to plugin development. So 7.9 point latest is what you could read that as. Now, I have had one participant try this out, and he came up with this brilliant idea that you can also use this image for purposes of continuous integration. So rather than having to repeat all the various environmental setups and maintenance in tools like Travis or Circle CI, then you can use their tools, Docker abilities to run these commands as well. Failed to start. That will. Naturally, I applied some updates before. Let's restart that. Hopefully that's not going to be too disturbing, but we'll see. So the way that you generate a plugin is effectively as this command shows. So we're using Docker to run the command. The entry point for this image is bash. So here, all of this are arguments to bash. So we're just asking bash run the Logstash plugin generate command. And the only real magic here is we've bind mounted our current directory to be /work within the container. I think it's going to work good. Cool, I've got that up to date. So here is a directory. I'm going to create a new plugin. This is going to be a Ruby plugin, bearing in mind that the Logstash plugin generate command only creates Ruby plugins at the moment. So I'm going to call this the taster. It's a filter. So I'm going to end up with a plugin called Logstash filter taster. So let's run that. And if you've used Docker for a while, this will be very familiar. I'm using PowerShell in case you're wondering, but the command will be identical if you're on a bash environment. So the command I want is Logstash plugin generate type equals filter. You could say input output filter or codec. I should also mention there is a concept of integration plugins, which are basically a way of taking similar plugins and munging them into one package. I haven't looked at that though, so I'm not going to talk about that any further. The name of my filter plugin is taster, and the path where it's going to create this directory is /work. So it's going to create /work Logstash filter taster. So it's going to end up here. So let's have a look. There you go. Most of the time spent doing this is just waiting for the Logstash environment to start up. The actual creation is pretty simple. So let's have a look at what else we need to do in order to get started. Bearing in mind, some of what I'm going to show you is just because I'm in Windows and I have to be able to treat my development environment in such a way that all my line endings are in a Unix format. So let's see, we start by initializing this as a Git repo. I think this might actually be required for Visual Studio Code, although I'm not 100% certain. Let's see. I'm going to change the configuration for this local Git repository to not try and manipulate line endings when I check in or check out files. I'm not making that change locally, globally, because I don't want to make assumptions for any other projects that I might be working on my laptop. Now I should be able to just start Visual Studio Code on this directory. And we're going to do a few extra things to help set this up. Sorry. It's not quite the directory I want it to be. Alas, I put that Git repository in the wrong place. CD, Logstash filter taster. There we go. Put it there. Config, blah, blah. And right. Sorry for that. So here's our new plugin. It's fairly simple. I'm not going to tell you what all the various files mean at the moment. So I just want to configure the rest of the environmental things that we need to get set up first. So if you haven't already, you'll need to install the various modules. So Control-Shift-P, install extensions, and remote containers. Remote containers is actually part of, I think it's this one here, remote development, which includes a few other ones as well. The important thing we need is remote containers. There are also similar things like remote SSH if you wanted to do similar things but on a remote server, or remote WSL if you wanted to use Windows subsystem for Linux, which I don't recommend for this, particularly if you're supporting older environments like, for example, Red Hat Enterprise Linux 6, which WSL maybe now it works okay, but certainly it was crashing when I was testing this. If you're going to be creating any runtime artifacts for a production environment, I would suggest you don't use WSL for this, just for reproducibility. So I've got that installed. The other one I would recommend is editor config. This is basically a way that you can tell participating editors, often via plugins, how you want the editor to behave with regards to the content in your Git repository. So we're going to use that to set line endings. So I've got both of those installed already. So we're going to need to create an editor config file. So right there. Fortunately, this includes useful syntax highlighting, and we're going to want end of line settings, line alif, so line feed, Unix style line endings. I'm going to exit that. The other thing I'm going to want is a git ignore. And a good way of getting started with git ignore, if you haven't seen it before, is gitignore.io, which redirects you to a different site now. And bear in mind, we're dealing with a Ruby, maybe we're dealing with a Java. It doesn't know about Logstash though. So Ruby, no, Ruby, that one. Java, create that, and now we get a useful git ignore. And we'll paste that in there. One thing that's useful to put in, I'm not sure if this is actually useful or not, but it's what other things seem to do. Or nice. Gemfile.lock. Actually, maybe I'll just show you that later, just so you can see it more obviously. Okay, we've got everything that we need to do. We're ready for our first check-in. Initial check-in after creation. So I'm going to add all of those. Save that. So now we're checked in and we're ready to go on with the next step. The next step is to introduce some of this dev container magic. So how do we do that? Easiest way, dev containers, it supports lots of different development sort of projects. So if you're doing Ruby stuff or particular web frameworks, it will try and recognize what kind of thing you're dealing with and suggest something, a useful starting point that has all the tools and stuff pre-installed. But it doesn't know about Logstash plugin development, so we're going to have to sort of do this from first principles a little bit. So here's an easy way of getting started with this. Note there's no Docker file in here initially, so we're just going to create a Docker file. I'm going to move this soon, but it just needs to be here so that when I tell the dev container environment that I want to create some configuration files, then it'll look in here and suggest some useful starting points. And the next thing is here. So I'm going to, using remote containers, add development container configuration files. So I went down here. This is part of the remote window parts of Visual Studio Code. I can also go Control-Shift-P and go remote containers, add development container configuration files. Because it's seen that I've got this Docker file here, it's suggested, oh, maybe you want to do something with your existing Docker file. So we do that. We're going to rename this slightly. The name here doesn't really matter. I am going to move this here into this dev container directory that it created along with this dev container.json. So we'll just refer to it there. Context, when it goes to build the container, is basically here, but you're not really going to have to do much within this. So you're not going to need to add anything or copy any files from here into your dev container, because this is all going to be bind mounted for you. So we will, however, want a shell, and we'll just use bin bash for that. There is the possibility of installing extra extensions. So we've already added a couple of extensions to Visual Studio, such as the remote containers one, and we'll get the editor config one. But you could add some extra ones that are local to the container itself. We're not going to do that here. The other thing to bear in mind, if you wanted to be able to do things like run tools like strace or possibly some debuggers, it's useful to have this ptrace capability, in which case you'd need to, remembering the comma, enable that. We don't need to do that at the moment. Shouldn't be any other changes that are necessary, other than we need a valid starting point for our Docker file. So typically this would look something like this. 7.9. However, what I often do, just because I actually have the image locally, and bearing in mind things like if I'm making changes routinely, I might just want to have a local image that I can refer to. Either will be fine. So most of the times yours might look like that, but you're welcome to fork it. Now we have these files configured, we should be able to start. So just before we do that, add dev container configuration. Okay, and the magic part begins when we do this. We say remote containers, reopen in container. Now, if I were to just open up this directory, the same directory now, Visual Studio would recognize that I've got a dev container configuration, and it would prompt me down here if I would actually want to open it, in which case, yes, you would. Okay. We'll see that this window sort of reloads. And then if you wanted, you can look at the log. If you're the type that likes some blinking logs, blinking lights. And basically what you see is it's injecting all those Visual Studio remote components within the container that you've created. Oh, and it will also add and build that container. So for example, if I had, when this loads, in my Docker file that I was showing you before, I could have created other things as well. So if I wanted to install some extra packages, well, first I would need to be root. The container that this is defined on starts off as builder. So you need to change the user to root and then change it back to builder if you wanted. And then bearing in mind this is a CentOS image, you could go yum install yes. Let's say we wanted things like TCP dump or strace because we were trying to diagnose a problem. And then we could relaunch that container. It would build it if you wanted, but generally you don't need that. Okay, so we're nearly at the end of this part of the demo. Here is our shell that is running within the container. You'll notice all our code is here, just as if it's a local environment. So let's actually see it, the proof of the pudding. Let's actually start work on a plugin. To do things like build it, there is a very minimal set of changes that we have to make. So this gem spec is what defines the plugin in terms of how it's packaged. And we need to make some changes in here. So just making the minimum changes necessary. This needs to be a URL. Oh no, git plugin dev, make it whatever you like. It doesn't need to be valid. This is expected to be a name, email address. And this is where you add any extra dependencies, but I'll show you that when I show you a fully worked plugin. Okay, so now save that. In Ruby stuff, because we've referred to some dependencies, that will often mean that we need to grab those dependencies, a process called vendoring. Actually, I'm not sure if Ruby calls it that or not. Anyway, the tool to do that is called rake. So we go rake vendor, which would go and look for the various dependencies that are needed. Some of these dependencies are only needed when we're doing the actual development. Others might be needed when we're creating the plugin. So we've gone and done that. The next thing we need to do is run the tests. So bundle exec rspec. This is takes a little bit of explaining. If you've used tools like a Python virtual environment, this will make a lot more sense. But basically, bundle is a way of having encapsulating all your dependencies and the versions that you want in one location, which could be particular to a product or a project. So bundle bundle exec is basically saying run this command, the rspec unit testing tool, within this bundle, which is specific to this folder. So bundle exec rspec basically runs rspec, but you don't want to run rspec by itself. You want to run it within the context of here. Disclaimer, I'm not a Ruby developer. So if I say something that sounds wrong, chances are it probably is. Now, if you've used RSpec before, you're thinking, why is this taking so long? Just remember, although this is Ruby, it's running in JRuby, so therefore it has to wait for Java to start up and do all that kind of annoying sort of things. So that's gone, it's done, it's sort of starting up. And by default, you get one unit test, which has turned out successful. Yay. Okay. And ideally, you want to have lots of these, and it does get quite addictive or oddly satisfying to see a little line of green dots marching across your screen. If there were any test failures, you would see like a big red F, which is quite convenient. Bearing in mind, we haven't, because this is Ruby, we haven't had to build anything yet. So all our unit testing was done with the code just sitting there as is. So how do we go actually about building it? To create the plugin, remembering the plugin is distributed as a gem file. So gem build, and then we're passing it this gem spec file. Oh, this is what I wanted to mention before. Before I do, here is the file that we've created. That's Logstash filter taster, the actual gem file, which is a binary file. We can see here it's ignored by Git by default because it was in our Git ignore. And somewhere along the way, I think probably when we ran rake vendor, rake vendor, it created this gemfile.lock. This is basically a listing of all the various dependencies and the versions that it's used. I'm not sure what the best practice is. I noticed when I was looking around the various Logstash plugins don't seem to include this in their Git repositories. So I'm just going to, now that I can remember the name properly, it was gemfile.lock. So I'm going to save that. Okay. So what do we got? We've got Git, we've got that, and we have that bit there. Okay, so without having to have set up much at all in the way of environment and tooling, I've created my very first extremely trivial Logstash plugin. So we've basically run out of time, so I'm not going to go over this next step, but I will show you how you can. I will show you where you can find more information about that. So in this first Ruby plugin, this was the DNS summary one. So if you go to github.com, Cameron Kerr NZ, Logstash filter, DNS summary. I'll give you a very brief run through of this. if you're not used to the layout, there's basically a spec in here. This contains all your testing code. This you don't write. That comes with the plugin. You basically add your tests into here. And you will find that you spend at least as much time writing your tests as you do writing your code. And this was really good because in this DNS summary plugin, I'm not only doing the public suffix library, but I've also got some iDNA stuff there as well for internationalized domain names. So this is a great way of getting started and making sure you know what you're doing, and it gives you a lot, a great deal of confidence in as you progress through your coding. So if you haven't done any sort of test-driven development before, you really will find it satisfying to actually to do this. The other thing that is unusual, even compared to other Logstash plugins, is that, and possibly I've mentioned it here. Yes, I have, is the concept of integration tests, or possibly these are end-to-end tests or system tests. I'm not a tester, so to me, it's all just integration tests. I have created a way of actually doing some extra testing, which also looks at things like performance. So you can have a look at this and get an idea for how can you actually meaningfully test beyond unit testing, testing for things like performance of your plugin. So I invite you to have a look around there. Like I say, I'll go into more detail on this on the YouTube channel when I actually create that episode. The other one, and this is the, so there are also things like logging tricks there as well. If you wanted to look at the MMDB stuff, Logstash filter MMDB. This is the pure Java plugin. So that's a useful study resource. I've had to sort of cobble some of this information from various sources, but there'll be an episode about that as well. And if you're curious and wanted to know more about how to actually create that MaxMind database, maybe you want to use it for something else, then that information is available as well. Now, one of the questions was with regards to Java development. So, is there any reason for giving preference to Ruby instead of Java or Python or any other language? Well, Python's not a useful language for Logstash plugin development because it simply is not part of that ecosystem, unless you wanted to have something that you send logs or events or whatever to something custom written in Python, which then sends it off to Logstash. So to that extent, it might be useful, but for Logstash plugins, Python's not an option. Otherwise, instead, between Ruby and Java, if you know Java, or if you have more ability to get some in-house support for writing Java, or if you're concerned about performance, then compared to Ruby, then I would recommend going the Java route. It's actually fairly simple, not being a Ruby developer and not really being a Java developer either. Actually, I found the Java stuff to be quite good. There's a bit of documentation that's lacking, but nothing that you couldn't work around. Could you show how your MMDB plugin's data differs from the stock GeoIP plugin schema? Okay. So within this this project here, let's see, the schema here is whatever you want it as. So here's an example. This is what the input looks like. So you describe the schema that you want here. The database type is, I'm calling it demo network. So this is like an identifier. This is what you want to describe it as. For example, if you're using one of the MaxMind ones, it might be something like GeoLight City, something like that. Or description, which is multilingual. So here I've got an English language description for demo network allocations. Call it whatever you like. MMDB does support IPv6. Here I've only used IPv4. And that's just a reflection of, we don't currently use IPv6 within our network. The types that are required is the important bit, and these type names actually come from MaxMind's documentation, and you can get a link to that. And this is what you want. The only thing that it needs to have, and it will include that by default, is this subnet. So here, all of these are optional. So for example, here I've got VLAN ID, and whenever it sees VLAN ID, it's going to expect that to be a 32-bit unsigned integer. Wherever I've got name, then that's going to be a UTF-8 string. So name, and so forth. The only thing that's required is the subnet. Does your MMDB plugin support simultaneous use of a corporate WAN MMDB file and a public internet MMDB file simultaneously? I'm going to assume that that's meaning how can I add my own internal information about GeoIP stuff to something like what to the MaxMind database files that MaxMind supports.
Correct.
The answer is not yet, and I don't really have any idea of when I would do that. But if you're curious, this blog post here, which is what informed all this, does show that it is possible. It's not as simple as you would think. Bearing in mind, you basically have to do this. You can't start with, as far as I understand it, you can't start with an MMDB file and add stuff to it. You need to use the CSV files that MaxMind provide. Bearing in mind, if you do that, you need to make sure that you comply with the restrictions that MaxMind have to put around how you actually consume that data. basically, you need to make sure that you keep it up to date because of this whole sort of rights to be forgotten or anonymous sort of requirement.
May I speak?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so let's assume there are two MMDB files. We could use sort of a concurrent read on both databases through the plugin to see if your smaller private data file has a hit on that IP, and a concurrent search through the public product, commercial product file to see whichever has a hit, and then return to the caller, I don't know, based on some simple policy.
You certainly could do that. So you could have, when you invoke this plugin in your Logstash configuration, you can say, do this kind of lookup using this database, and then maybe do another lookup with a different database, use some conditional logic there. But there's nothing currently that would sort of give a union of those two databases without you doing some of that work yourself.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you can use just two copies of the filter, just use one after the other, right, with a condition.
Could you speak that again, Michael? I can't hear you.
Yeah. I was saying, like, using two filters, just using two instances of the same filter with two different MMDB files.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
So within the same plugin, additional code is not required. Is that what you're implying? Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Just to give you some ideas of what I've done to create MMDB files already, which might help spark some of your interest as to how you could use it. I've had this extract information from a commercial IP address management tool, whose name I won't mention. I've also had it consume a reasonably complex Excel spreadsheet and spit out the JSON that was required from that. And that was all done using Python, which gives you a nice idea of how you can sort of make it work to however you need it. How do you go about adding a REST API geolocation provider as a parallel data source? You wouldn't use this plugin as a remote data source, but Logstash does provide out of the box a number. Well, I've never actually used it, but it provides a way of using a remote lookup functionality with an optional cache. Actually, I believe it has an optional cache. Yes, which is something you can only do in Logstash. If you know anything about things like the ingest node functionality, doing remote lookups is not something that you can do within Elasticsearch in case you're looking at that. But that's one of the reasons why you might also prefer investing some time in using a Java based plugin, because, and bear in mind, I haven't looked at this at all. It's just something that came into my mind like a couple of days ago. You could potentially create a Elasticsearch Logstash, sorry, not Logstash, Elasticsearch ingest node pipeline plugin, if such a thing exists. Maybe Michael can sort of pipe up on that. And you might be able to reuse some of that code there.
Yeah, I think one way to enrich data is to use the enrich plugin. So there's an enrich policy. You can define a policy and then use an index in Elasticsearch to enrich. So you just send the enrichment data into Elasticsearch, and then you can use an ingest, like enrichment processor in the ingest pipeline. But the data has to be in Elastic, so you can't really, do an external lookup from ingest pipelines. So if it sits in Elastic, you can kind of do a bit of a join with that.
Yeah, and that could also be a useful, and that could be a useful thing if you wanted to have something more real time. So, for example, you might consider real time IP information about things like what user is known on this IP, or what is the average response time, or what is the is this known to be a bad actor to the rifle? So that could be a useful thing for if people wanted to investigate.
So another option for there's a memcache plugin in Logstash, so you can just cache this information, or basically do the first lookup and then cache it in Logstash. That's yet another option.
So if I may clarify the answers that Michael and Cameron gave, similar to the act of opening the MMDB file using the Java code that I saw on your GitHub repo, the answer is that one cannot invoke a REST API in the Logstash architecture. Is that correct? And one has to switch to the enrich architecture. Is that the answer?
No.
For looking up a given IP.
You can do it in either. If you wanted to use something remote, i.e. outside of Logstash or Elasticsearch, you would need to use Logstash. If you wanted to constrain to information that was available within Elasticsearch, you could use an ingest node enrich lookup there as part of a pipeline.
Yeah, Logstash has HTTP filter that can do lookups for you. The problem with external lookups, like typically with network data, there's a lot of it, and like you just can't afford to do external lookups. That's purely sort of the latency just wouldn't allow you to kind of do proper lookups. So if you have to do external lookups, you have to use caching in Logstash. So you only do the first lookup, and then you cache things for subsequent lookups. A better option is to kind of ingest the feed into Elasticsearch and use enrichment pipelines. Like if you're thinking about threat intelligence or a list of IP addresses that you want to enrich against, you want to use like a policy with the ingest pipeline.
Yep, exactly. That's the use case I had. So both of you hang out in the Slack channels in the Elastic community, Michael and Cameron. If I have follow-up questions, can I find you on the Slack channels?
Yes, definitely. So ping me directly on the Slack community Slack channel. I typically, there's a lot going on there, and I'm only sort of visiting it occasionally. But yeah, if you ping me directly, I'm there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both.
I'm not present on the Slack channels, but I'm willing to take sort of issues or emails.
Yes, I can find you on your GitHub repo, I'm sure. In the issues area.
Yeah, Michael pasted the URL for the Slack, for the community Slack in the chat.
I'm just looking at some other questions. Could you show how your MMDB plugin data schema ECS differs from the stock GeoIP plugin schema? As coded, it knows nothing about how ECS might use that. Let's see if I can show you an example. Oh yeah, big time. So here's an example of using my plugin. As you can see, it's very similar to GeoIP's plugin, and that's by design. So the idea is that you just specify a source field that you want there, and what target you would like to put those fields into. And then you have to specify a path to the demo. And you can optionally say which of those fields you want to include. By default, it'll include all of them. Any other questions?
There was a question asked earlier, and we'll talk about answering it at the end, saying, our logs had the IP address of the load balancer reverse proxy written to logs instead of the source machine. Did you come across a problem like this? How would you suggest solving it? I don't think.
I
think that was asked earlier.
Right.
I don't
okay.
know. It's not very relevant to the actual to Logstash, but you know, if someone needs help, maybe that's
a brilliant example of somewhere where you might currently want a custom plugin. Specifically, it would be a custom input plugin, but it depends very much on how you've got your load balancer set up. If you have so specifically, it will depend on the relationship between the incoming TCP connection between your sending machine and your load balancer and Logstash. So if you can guarantee that each individual contributing TCP connection from the server that's sending the logs maps to an individual TCP connection back to Logstash, then you could potentially, and this depends on your reverse proxy load balancer deployment, you might get away with using something like a proxy protocol. Logstash doesn't support this as far as I'm aware. When we talk about this kind of proxy protocol, we often capitalize it. But basically what that does is it prepends to the beginning of the TCP connection information about where the client connection came from. That might help. I'm not sure I'd want to use it though, to be honest. If you wanted to look at this from a high availability point of view, I would recommend instead using something like a round robin DNS, possibly with some floating IP addresses, using a tool such as Pacemaker to float an IP or a set of IPs between different nodes that have, you know, the role of accepting Logstash connections. That's how I would do it. That's how I've done it. I really wouldn't like to be putting that kind of information through a load balancer unless that is HTTP.
Yeah. So I think it refers to the HTTP load balancer that terminates TCP connections and then create a new one on the inbound. And Sid and I have basically provided the answer that, according to the spec, some of the load balancers, as far as I know, they'll provide the X forwarded for like a HTTP header, so that could be one option. So if it's a HTTP traffic, it's useful to have a look at the header. That may not be always possible, but
yeah, so you know, it depends very much on the implementation of the reverse proxy. I've dealt with a few, both layer 7 and sort of layer 4 ones. So yeah, it depends. So if you're doing HTTP logs, then yes, that could be a feasible thing to do. If not, then avoid it and just use some a bunch of IPs that you can float around.
Yeah, I think we've answered all the questions so far.
Well, the PowerPoint that Cameron is showing right now, that will be available somewhere, the cheat sheet. It's a very good getting started guide for bootstrapping a plugin.
It will be available, yes. I was planning on making it available when I finished making all the 4 episodes. but I think I will probably preempt that. So I'll put that up somewhere like where do you share PowerPoint things these days?
Put it as a PDF. That's fine.
You can PDF it, check it into GitHub. As good as anything.
That works.
Yeah. So I'll put that available. Make that available.
Yeah, as long as it's a text and not images, because like for copying and pasting the code, it'd be useful.
I guess I could use something like SlideShare.
Good stuff. Okay, I think we're done here. Thanks a lot. There's a lot of information I wanted to find out for myself, right? I wanted to get stuck into remote development using Docker. That was very exciting, and especially using the Visual Studio Code. That was really, really interesting. So I built my own plugins the hard way. This seems to be a much better way to go about things. It was very, very useful. I'd like to thank Cameron, and thanks all of you for attending and asking great questions. And the recording, I understand, will be available, so we'll send you links. We'll go through the meetup sites. So we'll publish the link to the recording or YouTube video, and and the slides and the GitHub repo.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot, Cameron. And
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone, or afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Take care all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.